So does the brain create consciousness? I mean, what's the big deal, right? All that stuff that we experience, sights, sounds, tastes, the brain just makes that, right? Well, maybe not. Let's get into it. So, seriously, what is all the fuss, right? I mean, some philosophers object to the idea that the brain creates consciousness. But why? I mean, what's the big problem? You go to sleep, consciousness is gone. You have a dream or you wake up, boom, there it is again. So obviously, it seems like the brain must be behind it, must create it. And that is a metaphysical position known as physicalism. Physicalism, being an answer to the mind-body problem, says, well, matter in the brain is primary and it creates consciousness. So the problem is we really know how, we have no idea how this could possibly work. And that might sound kind of strange, especially coming from a neuroscience guy like myself. But let me give you some examples and you'll see why philosophers have a big problem with this idea. And even the ones who defend physicalism, like Daniel Dennett, for example, he's a very famous physicalist philosopher, very eloquent defender, recognizes that some of these issues are at least need to be worked out. All right. So, well, let me give you an example. Right. So you got sound. All right. So compression waves in the air hit the ear, hit the eardrum, causing a chain reaction that leads to stimulation of the auditory cortices in the brain, and then we hear a sound. So the question is, how is it that compression waves and the inner ear workings and the neural firings, we don't experience any of that? So how is it that that translates into a sound that we hear? Let me give you another example. So when we see things like colors, for example, it's electromagnetic waves hitting the retinal color cells, color detector cells, and that sends messages into the visual cortices, and then we see the color red, right? So there's something missing in this causal chain of explanation here, and it's how does buzzing neurons somehow create the subjective experience of X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. All right, pain. Pain's another one that's used by philosophers a lot because it's something everybody knows pretty well, and it's strongly associated and correlated with the firing of pain fibers. So you might think, oh, okay, so pain fibers cause pain, right? But what is it about buzzing pain fibers that translates somehow into the subjective experience of ouch? And here's another problem, phantom limb pain. So in that instance, we're experiencing pain when there isn't even a limb, okay? And so what's up with that? In fact, the same pain might feel different under different circumstances. This is another aspect of pain that physicians like myself know all too well. That your mental state, your mood, your anxiety level can all affect how your pain is experienced. So it's not just pain fibers. There's a whole lot more going on here. Okay, so, all right, that might be an issue, but I mean, really, so what? Just because we don't know how it works right now doesn't mean we won't eventually figure it out, right? And that sounds pretty reasonable. Physicalists, in fact, often say that. This is something that critics of physicalism call promissory materialism, right? Someday neuroscience will figure it out. But the problem with that is that the burden of proof rests with the claimant. So if a physicalist says the brain causes consciousness, but it can't produce a mechanism, then all they say is someday neuroscience will figure it out. It's kind of hard to take that claim seriously. But you might be willing to forgive that if you say, okay, but it is kind of realistic though, right? I mean, neuroscience has progressed, we've moved along, and we've learned a lot. Well, but maybe not. Because the problem with neuroscience is that as amazing as it is, and I think it is truly amazing, it really only produces correlations. It produces correlations with neural activity and then the subjective experience reported by the subject. So if all we're ever going to get is more and more and more correlations, granted they'll be more precise, they might be exquisitely precise someday, but it's still just correlations, right? We still don't know what causes what there. And the problem is we don't have a causal mechanism. So that's the piece that seems to be missing. And because of this, there are a number of philosophers who have decided, well, maybe the problem is the question we're asking. Maybe the problem is wrongly posed. In other words, the question that we're asking is, how does brain activity cause consciousness? Well, maybe it doesn't, and that's the answer. And the reason why we can't find any explanation or causal chain is because it actually doesn't work that way. So you might be asking yourself, okay, but like how else could it work? Consider this. Let's say you've got a good old-fashioned television and you love the I Love Lucy show, okay? And every time you turn it on, you've got it just specifically tuned to the I Love Lucy channel, right? Whatever that is. Let's say there is one. Actually, if there isn't one, there should be one. But I digress. So, okay, every time I turn it on, I see Lucy. If I turn it off, Lucy disappears. If I turn it on and I turn up the contrast or the brightness, Lucy gets brighter or dimmer. So I might then think, the television is causing Lucy to appear. But it's not quite like that, is it? Not in this case. It could be that the brain works in a similar way. The I Love Lucy show is actually being caused by the broadcast. The television is the receiver of the broadcast. It is possible, and we don't have any way to prove that this is not how it works, but it is possible that the brain does the same kind of thing, that consciousness is a kind of pervasive field throughout the universe, and that's an idea called Panpsychism, and that the brain basically just tunes into it. Okay, but do we really need to conjure up woo-woo ideas like that, right? It sounds like a bunch of hand-wavy voodoo, right? I mean, can't we just say, okay, fine, so if the brain doesn't create consciousness, maybe we can just say that the neural pattern just simply is the experience that's correlating with it. I mean, that's one way that you can go. You can say it's just a bunch of semantics, right? Like the evening and the morning star. They get different names, but it's really just Venus. Okay? But there's a problem with that, right? So the problem is, let's consider an example from classic philosophy, right? So Aristotle in his Metaphysics talks about statues of Zeus, right? So you've got two statues of Zeus. One's made of marble, and one is made of bronze. Okay, so they're both Zeus, but the material that composes those statues is different. And no matter how hard I may look, I can look at marble at microscopic detail all day long, and I won't find Zeus in the marble. Okay, it's a property of the form of the matter. So the form may be identical to these two instances, but the materials are different. So this saying that the brain activity is the consciousness is sort of like saying Zeus just simply is the marble. But the problem is that you can create Zeus from other things too, and so it can't be identical. So then that gets back to the issue of consciousness. Consciousness appears to be a property of certain forms of matter. In other words, it's a holistic quality of certain types of systems. And that brings up the idea of emergence, right? So some systems that are complex enough will display emergent properties. Those properties are irreducible to the parts that compose the systems. This is not mysterious, right? We see this all the time. The question is, where do the emergent properties come from? That's the question. And you can use this idea, and some philosophers do this, to try to explain consciousness while still remaining physicalist. Say, okay, fine, so the brain is super complicated, no argument there, And it's so complex that consciousness becomes an emergent property of that. And consciousness is irreducible because of that very quality. But then if it's irreducible, then it means that brains can't really create it because it doesn't reduce to the brain. That's the whole meaning of the term irreducible. All right, and this is something that philosophers like Jaegwon Kim have pointed out with the whole concept of emergence. Now, brains are still necessary to display consciousness, at least as we know it, but they don't seem to be sufficient. There's something else arising that has more to do with the form that the brain is adopting. And by form, I don't just mean shape, I mean the behavior. And that seems to be what's going on with consciousness. Consciousness seems to be related to the form of the matter, not so much the matter itself. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example to kind of take this out of the abstract for a minute. Consider a melody. All right, let's think about Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Very famous. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, I'll stop. Anyway, so let's take a look at that melody, right? You can hear the whole melody and it has a certain quality to it. It's beautiful, it's uplifting, it's intended to be those things. But if I look at each individual note that composes it, I won't find Ode to Joy in any of the notes. It's the form that the notes take that give you the melody. Okay, so it is possible, I believe this is likely, that consciousness works like that, and that the brain is necessary. But it has the consciousness itself, the subjective experience, has more to do with the form that it takes rather than the actual neural tissue itself per se. It's how they're arranged that what makes a big difference. So there you have it. Now you know why some of the philosophers object to the idea that the brain just creates consciousness. It turns out that it's actually way more complicated than that. Go figure. Now, whether you believe that or not, look into it further. Look into it further. I used to be a physicalist myself, but then after looking into a lot of this stuff, I changed. But what do you think? All right, put your comments down there below and tell us what you think. And we'll see you next time.